They gave me a Lifetime Achievement Award on the night they took my life's work away from me. And the cruelest part was that they made me smile for it in front of 300 people. It was the 30th anniversary gala of Vale Architects, the firm I had built from a single drafting table in a rented room, and I stood on a stage in a room full of clients and partners and the most important people in my profession. And the young man I had raised like a son, my protégé Adrian Frost, took the microphone and delivered a speech about my legacy so warm and so eloquent that half the room was crying, and then, still smiling, still radiant with affection, he announced that the firm was entering a bold new chapter, that I would be stepping into the honored role of founder emeritus, and that he would be assuming leadership as managing principal, effective immediately. Emeritus. The word landed on me like a stone dressed in silk, and the room applauded because it had been framed as an honor, a graceful passing of the torch, a beloved old master stepping back to let his brilliant heir carry the firm forward. And I stood there in my own name's spotlight, and I understood, in the space of a single sentence, that I had just been removed from the company I founded in public by the person I trusted most in the world, and that if I said one word of protest, I would look like a bitter old man who couldn't let go. So I smiled. I raised my glass. I let 300 people applaud my own execution. Stay with me, because what Adrian Frost did not understand, as he sat down in my chair to that thunderous applause, was that the chair was empty. Everything that made it worth stealing, the clients, the name, the single career-defining commission the whole firm was built to win, was loyal to me and not to it, and I was about to show him quietly, completely, exactly what he had actually stolen, which was nothing at all. My name is Julian Vale. I am an architect, one of the more celebrated of my generation, though I take less pride in that word now than I once did, and I have spent 40 years learning to make buildings that make people feel something when they walk into them, which is the only kind of building worth making. I want to tell you the whole of this story, from the gala to the reckoning, because I think there is a particular kind of betrayal that does not get talked about enough, the betrayal by the person you mentored, the young one you raised, the heir you chose and shaped and loved, and I think it is in some ways the loneliest betrayal of all, because you cannot even hate the traitor cleanly since you made him, and every good thing in him is partly your doing, and so is, you come to fear every bad thing. So let me tell you how you build a legacy, and how a legacy learns to knife you, and how an old man who has been declared past his prime turns out to be holding the one card the young genius never thought to look for. Let me tell you how I built Vale Architects, because you cannot understand what was taken until you understand what it was. I started with nothing, the son of a bricklayer, and I put myself through architecture school working construction, which turned out to be the best training I ever got, because I learned buildings from the mortar up before I ever learned them from the drawing down, and to this day I can walk onto any site and know in my bones whether a thing will stand. I opened my own firm at 32, in a rented room with one drafting table and more debt than sense, and for years it was just me and a phone that didn't ring often enough. And then I got my chance, the chance every architect prays for and few ever get, a commission for a small art museum in a mid-sized city, a project everyone else had passed on because the budget was impossible and the site was a nightmare, a steep riverbank that no sane architect wanted. And I did something with that impossible site and that impossible budget that changed my life. I designed a museum that seemed to float above the river, a building of glass and light that glowed at dusk like a paper lantern on the water, and the city started calling it exactly that, the lantern, and it won every award there is, and it put Vale Architects and me on the map of the profession forever. The lantern was mine. Every line of it. I want you to remember that, because it becomes very important later, when a younger man decides that a building glowing on a riverbank might as well have been his. I want to tell you how the lantern actually happened, because it matters to everything, and because it is the truest thing about who I am, as opposed to who Adrian tried to convince the world I had become. Everyone told me not to take that commission. Every established architect had passed on it precisely because the site was impossible, a steep, unstable riverbank, and the budget wouldn't cover a conventional building on flat ground, let alone that. My few advisors told me it would ruin me, that a young architect's first major project failing publicly would end me before I started. And I took it anyway, and I took it because of the very thing that made it impossible. I stood on that riverbank at dusk one evening, trying to understand why every solution I tried had failed, and I watched the light come off the water, and I understood all at once that I had been fighting the site when I should have been listening to it, that the building did not need to sit on the difficult bank, it needed to float above it and catch the light coming off the river, to be made of the very thing everyone thought was the problem. I designed the whole of the lantern in one feverish night, on the floor of my rented room, and I nearly went bankrupt building it. And there was a night, as I told a frightened young man years later, when I was certain I'd destroyed myself. And then it opened, and it glowed, and people wept walking into it, and I knew that the thing that had saved me was the exact thing that had frightened everyone else away, which is the deepest law of any creative life, that the impossible commission is the only one worth taking, because the possible ones make you competent and the impossible ones make you yourself. That is who designed the lantern. A man who ran toward the thing everyone else ran from. Hold that, because 40 years later a man would try to convince the world that this same man had become too timid, too obsolete, too past his prime to be trusted with the future, and the building glowing on the riverbank had already answered him, decades before he was even born. For 20 years after the lantern, Vale architects rose and rose. We designed concert halls and libraries and university buildings and one small, perfect chapel that I still think may be the best thing I ever made. I became, over those decades, one of the names people mention, and my firm became a place that the most talented young architects in the world wanted to work, and my name over the door meant something, meant a standard, meant a way of thinking about buildings that I had spent my whole life refining. I married the love of my life, Helen, a painter, who taught me more about light than any physics class ever did, and Helen and I never had children, which was the one grief of an otherwise blessed life. And it is a grief that matters to this story, because it is the reason that when a brilliant, hungry, fatherless young architect named Adrian Frost walked into my firm 12 years ago, I did not just hire him. I adopted him in every way but the legal one. I made him the son that Helen and I never had. And that choice, made freely and with my whole heart, is the wound at the center of everything I am about to tell you. Adrian was 26 when I hired him, and he was the most naturally gifted young architect I had seen in 30 years. And he had come up hard, poor, no connections, a chip on his shoulder the size of a cornerstone, and I saw myself in him so completely that it frightened me a little. So I did for Adrian what no one had done for me. I mentored him, not casually, not the way a senior partner nods at a junior. I poured myself into him. I brought him into every important meeting, taught him not just how to design but how to see, how to talk to clients, how to read a room, how to fight for a good idea and when to let a bad one go. I gave him the best projects. I put his name forward for honors. I introduced him to every important client and patron I had, personally with my hand on his shoulder, saying this is the future, watch this one. I gave Adrian Frost over 12 years everything I knew, everything I had, and I did it gladly, joyfully, because Helen had died by then, 5 years into Adrian's time with us, and after I lost her, Adrian was, in a real and aching way, the only family I had left, and pouring my life's knowledge into him was the closest thing I had to the fatherhood I'd been denied. Let me tell you about Helen, because she is woven through all of this even in her absence, and because I think if she had lived, none of it would have happened, and that thought is one I have to be careful with because it can swallow a man. Helen was a painter, and she saw the world in a way I never could, and where I understood light as a physicist understands it, angles and lumens and the science of how it falls, Helen understood it as a lover understands the beloved, and she taught me, over 30 years of marriage, to stop calculating light and start listening to it, which is the single thing that made my buildings more than competent, that made them move people. Helen also saw people the way she saw light, all the way through, past the surface to the truth of them, and I have thought many times since that if Helen had been alive when Adrian began to change, she would have seen it years before I did, because I was blinded by love and by the sun-shaped hole in my life, but Helen was never blinded by anything. She saw what was actually there. She met Adrian only in his first years with us, before the turning, and she liked him, but I remember one thing she said once, quietly, after a dinner where Adrian had been particularly charming. She said, "He's hungry, that one. Watch that it stays a good hunger." I didn't understand it then. I thought she meant ambition, and ambition is good in a young architect. I understand now that Helen had seen, in one dinner, the thing it took me 12 years and a public execution to see, that there are two kinds of hunger, the kind that drives you to build and the kind that drives you to take, and that they look identical in a young person and diverge only when the stakes get high enough to reveal which one was underneath all along. Helen saw it in an evening. Helen saw everything. And when I lost her, 5 years into Adrian's time with me, I lost not only the love of my life but the one set of eyes that might have warned me, and I turned, in my grief, toward the young man who felt like a son, and I gave him even more of myself than before, because he was all I had left, and I did it with the specific reckless generosity of a grieving man, and I never once heard Helen's warning echoing under the affection, "Watch that it stays a good hunger." until it was far, far too late. I told him more than once that he would run the firm one day. I meant it. I was building toward it. I intended, when the time was right, to hand him everything freely with love, the way you hand a son the keys to the house. He did not need to steal a single thing. That is the part one cannot get past, even now. He did not need to take anything. It was all going to be his. He just couldn't wait to be given it and couldn't bear that it would be a gift rather than a conquest. And so he took what he would have been handed. And in the taking, he broke the one thing that could never be given back, which was what we were to each other. Let me give you one memory of Adrian from the early years so you understand what I lost, because the loss is not really the firm is just the visible part. The loss is this. In Adrian's second year with me, we were working late on a difficult project, just the two of us in the studio at 2 a.m, and Adrian was stuck, truly stuck, on a problem he couldn't solve, and I watched him get more and more frustrated, and finally he threw his pencil down and said he wasn't good enough, that I'd made a mistake believing in him, that he was a fraud who'd fooled everyone. And I sat down next to him and I told him the truth, which was that every architect worth anything has that exact night, over and over, the night you're certain you're a fraud, and that the fraudulence you feel is not a sign that you don't belong, it's the sign that you actually care, that you can see the gap between what you've made and what you dreamed, and that the people who never feel like frauds are the ones you have to worry about, because it means they can't see the gap, which means they'll never close it. And I told him about my own worst night on the lantern, when I was certain I'd ruined the one chance of my career, and how I'd pushed through it, and how the thing on the other side of that terror was the best work I'd ever done. And Adrian listened, this hungry, fatherless kid, and something settled in him, and he picked the pencil back up, and by dawn he'd solved the problem, and it was brilliant, and he looked at me with an expression I will never forget, an expression of pure gratitude and something like love, and he said, "Nobody ever talked to me like that before, like I was worth the trouble." And I told him he was worth the trouble, that he'd always been worth the trouble, and I meant it with my whole heart. That is the Adrian I lost. That is the boy I grieve. And I have asked myself 10,000 times how the kid who threw down his pencil at 2 a.m. because he was afraid he wasn't good enough became the man who took a microphone at my gala and cut me out of my own life with a smile. And the only answer I have ever found is that the fear never left him. The fraudulence he felt that night never healed. It just went underground and turned into hunger, into a need to seize and prove and never be at anyone's mercy again. And that I healed the symptom that night but never touched the wound, because the wound was older than me and deeper than anything a mentor can reach. I gave him everything I could give. I could not give him peace. No one can give another person peace. And the lack of it, in the end, is what turned my son into my rival. Let me tell you how the turning happened, because it happened slowly, and I missed it the way you miss a hairline crack in a foundation until the day the wall comes down. Somewhere around year 8 or 9, Adrian changed, though I told myself he was only maturing, coming into his own, which a mentor is supposed to want. He began to chafe at being second. He began to take credit, subtly at first, in ways I excused, for work that had been collaborative or that had been largely mine. He began to cultivate the firm's other partners and its most important clients directly, building his own relationships, which again I encouraged because I wanted him to be able to carry the firm, and I did not see, because I did not want to see, that he was not building those relationships to carry the firm. He was building them to carry himself, away from me and eventually over me. And he began, this is the part that took me longest to understand, to plant a quiet idea everywhere, gently, always with a tone of loving concern, the idea that Julian Vale, the great Julian Vale, was perhaps beginning to slow down, that my aesthetic was of another era, that I was resistant to new technology, new methods, the direction the profession was heading, that the firm needed to modernize, and that its beloved founder, brilliant as he had been, might be becoming a gentle obstacle to its future. He never said it as an attack. He said it as a son worried about an aging father, which is the most devastating way to say it, because it is unanswerable, because any vigor you show in response just proves how touchy the old man has gotten about his decline. There were warning signs, and I want to name a few of them, not to flagellate myself, but because someone listening may be seeing the same signs right now and mistaking them, as I did, for something benign. There was the way Adrian began, subtly, to control who had access to me, positioning himself as the necessary intermediary between me and the partners, between me and certain clients, always framed as protecting my time, always framed as service, so that slowly, without my noticing, more and more of the firm's information flowed through Adrian and less reached me directly. There was the way he began to schedule the important meetings at times he knew I couldn't easily attend, and then to summarize them for me afterward, his summary, his framing, so that my picture of my own firm became increasingly Adrian's picture of my firm. There was the way disagreements with him started to cost me, socially, within the firm, the way the younger staff began to treat a difference of opinion with Adrian as evidence that the old man was being difficult, resistant, stuck. And there was the specific, chilling thing that I only recognized in hindsight, which is that Adrian began to write things down differently, to create a paper record in which his contributions were emphasized and mine were softened, an archive being quietly edited in real time to support a history that hadn't happened yet. Each of these, on its own, was nothing, was explicable, was even, in the most generous reading, a young leader coming into his own, and that is exactly why they worked, because a betrayal by 1,000 small reasonable-seeming moves is invisible until you step back and see the pattern, and I never stepped back, because stepping back would have meant entertaining a suspicion about the person I loved most, and I could not bring myself to do it, and my inability to suspect my own son was precisely the blind spot he was counting on. The people who love most are the easiest to move against, because love is, by its nature, a lowered guard, and the ones who exploit that are exploiting the best thing in us, not the worst, which is what makes it so hard to see coming and so hard to forgive afterward. I want to be fair, even now, even after everything, because fairness is the only dignity a betrayed man has left. Some of what Adrian said was not entirely false, and that is what made it work. I was in my 60s. I had my ways. I was not as fluent in the newest software as the 25-year-olds, though I could still outdesign any of them with a pencil. There is always just enough truth in the case against an aging master to make the lie go down easy, and Adrian, who I had personally taught to read a room and find its soft spot, used every one of those skills on the room that was my own firm, and he used them on me, and I did not recognize what was happening because I had taught him to be subtle, and I was proud of how subtle he had become, right up until the subtlety was a knife between my ribs. The gala was the culmination, and I understand now that it had been planned for months. A quiet campaign conducted among the partners and the board, each of them approached privately by Adrian. Each of them told some version of a story in which easing the founder into an honored emeritus role was the kind, graceful, necessary thing to do, the thing that was best for everyone, including me, especially me. By the time I walked into that gala, the votes had been counted in rooms I wasn't in, the decision had been made in my absence about my own firm, and the public announcement was not a proposal, it was a coronation, staged in front of 300 witnesses precisely so that I could not fight it without becoming, in that instant, the bitter old man clinging to power that the story required me to be. Adrian had learned the most important lesson I ever taught him, which is that you win the real battle before anyone knows a battle is happening, and that by the time the public sees the fight, it should already be over. He learned it from me. He used it on me. There is a terrible pride I still feel, buried under the grief, at how well he learned. I want you to sit inside that gala moment with me for a second, because it is a specific and modern kind of cruelty, the ambush disguised as a tribute, and I think more people have suffered a version of it than would ever say so out loud. There is no defense against being honored. If a man attacks you, you can fight back. But if a man stands up in front of 300 people and praises you, weeps over your legacy, calls you a giant of the profession, and then, in the same breath, gently relieves you of all your power while the room glows with affection, there is nothing you can do, because any resistance, any flicker of the truth, would look like ingratitude, like ego, like exactly the bitter clinging that the whole performance was designed to make you seem guilty of. Adrian had built a trap out of love and applause, and it was airtight. I stood on that stage and I did the arithmetic in real time, and I understood that I had two choices in that instant. I could seize the microphone and tell the truth and become, forever, in the memory of everyone in that room, the great Julian Vale who fell apart at his own tribute and had to be eased out, proving Adrian's whole thesis in one ugly moment. Or I could smile and raise my glass and keep my powder dry and let them think it had worked. The discipline that took, the sheer physical effort of holding my face still and warm while my life was taken from me in public, was the hardest thing I have ever done, harder than the impossible sights, and I did it because 40 years of standing calm on collapsing job sites had taught me that the man who panics in the moment of collapse dies in it, and the man who stays still, thinking, watching, lives to rebuild. I even embraced Adrian, to the room's delight, the gracious old master and his beloved heir, and only the two of us knew what was actually passing between us in that embrace, and I whispered nothing, because there was nothing to whisper that would not give away that I was still awake. I let him believe I was asleep. It is the oldest move there is, and the young never see it coming, because the young cannot imagine that stillness is anything other than surrender. That was the single most important thing Adrian never learned from me, in the end, despite everything I taught him, that the quiet of a strong man and the quiet of a beaten man look identical from the outside, and that mistaking the one for the other is the most expensive error a person can make. If you have listened this far, let me stop and ask you the question I sat with in the car after that gala. Still in my tuxedo, the applause still ringing in my ears because I need to know how you would have answered it. When the person you raised, the child of your spirit if not your blood, betrays you with the very skills you gave them, is the betrayal theirs, or is it partly yours, for having made them so capable and so hungry and so much like the harder parts of yourself? I have not fully answered that question, and I am not sure I ever will. Tell me in the comments where you land, because it is the question that separates this betrayal from all the others, the fact that I made the knife that went into me. Stay with me, though, because the question of whose fault it was is different from the question of what I did about it. And what I did about it is the reason I am telling you this from my own chair, restored, and not from the emeritus corner Adrian designed for me to fade away in. I did not fight at the gala. I did not fight for weeks after. And I want to tell you what those weeks were like, because the silence of a sideline man is easily mistaken for defeat, and Adrian mistook it for exactly that, and his mistake was the beginning of his undoing. I accepted the emeritus title with public grace. I cleared out of the managing principal's office, my office, the one with the model of the lantern on the shelf, and I let Adrian move into it. I attended the transition meetings and said supportive things. I played, to perfection, the role of the gracious old founder stepping aside, because I understood, with the cold clarity that has never once failed me, that a sideline man who rages confirms every word his enemy has said about him, while a sideline man who goes quiet and watchful becomes something far more dangerous, an underestimated man with time on his hands and nothing left to lose. So I went quiet. The quiet was not empty. People assumed, Adrian assumed, that a sideline founder in an emeritus corner was simply fading, going gently, and I let them assume it, but the quiet was one of the most productive periods of my life because for the first time in 40 years I was not running a firm, I was watching one, and watching is where all the truth is. And I was not entirely alone in that quiet, because there was Dorothy. Dorothy Chun had run my studio for 30 years, since she was a young woman, and she knew everything, where every drawing was archived, which client trusted whom, what had really happened in every project going back decades, and Dorothy had watched the whole slow coup with eyes even sharper than mine, and unlike me, she had not been blinded by love because Dorothy had never quite trusted Adrian, in the way that the people who run the back office often see through the golden boys long before the principals do. In those quiet emeritus weeks, Dorothy started, without either of us ever quite saying what we were doing, to bring me things. A file I might want. A record of who had actually authored what. A quiet word about which partners had been in which private meetings. She never framed it as taking sides. She simply, in 100 small acts, made sure that the man who had built the place kept his access to the truth of it. And I understood that Dorothy had made her decision about where her loyalty lay long before I asked, and that she was, in her undramatic way, one of the load-bearing walls of my whole life that I had walked past for 30 years without ever fully seeing. The shine never seized the Dorothys. Adrian, in all his brilliance, had never once thought about the woman who knew where every drawing was kept, and that oversight, the failure to understand that the person who controls the archive controls the history, was one of 100 ways his hunger for the visible power blinded him to where the real power actually lived. And in the quiet, I did what I have always done best, better even than design. I looked at the actual structure of the thing, the load paths, the foundations, and I asked myself a single question that Adrian, in his hunger for the chair, had never thought to ask. What actually holds this firm up? And the answer, when I worked it out, made me understand that Adrian had staged an elaborate coup to capture a throne room whose walls I could remove whenever I chose. Let me tell you what I found when I looked at the foundations, because it is the heart of everything, and it is the thing the young and the hungry never understand about the things the old and the patient have built. Adrian had captured the title. He had the partners, the board, the office, the managing role, the name on the letterhead as principal. He had, in short, the chair. But a firm like mine is not held up by a chair. It is held up by three things, and Adrian, who had spent his whole ascent focused on the visible power, the title and the office, had never truly grasped that he controlled none of the three. This is the great blind spot of the ambitious young, and I say this not with contempt but with recognition, because I was young once too, and I want anyone listening who is climbing toward something to hear it. There are two kinds of power in any organization, in any endeavor, in any life, and they are easy to confuse and they are not the same. There is visible power, which is the title, the office, the chair, the name on the door, the thing everyone can see and that everyone competes for. And there is real power, which is the relationships, the trust, the knowledge, the loyalty, the things that are invisible and that actually make the visible things work. The ambitious almost always chase the visible power because it is visible, because you can point to it, because seizing it feels like winning. And again they capture the visible power and discover, too late, that it was hollow, that the real power was somewhere else the whole time, held quietly by people they never thought to court, resting on foundations they never bothered to examine. Adrian spent years and burned a lifetime of my love to capture the chair, the most visible thing in the firm, and he never once asked who the clients were actually loyal to, or who owned the name, or who controlled the archive, or where the Great Commission actually lived, because those were invisible and Adrian had never in his life learned to value what he could not see and could not display. That was the flaw beneath all his talent. He could design a building, but he could not see the load paths of power, and a man who cannot see the load paths will always, eventually, stand triumphant in a room a moment before it collapses on him, because he captured the thing that looked like it was holding the weight and never noticed the actual columns, which were somewhere else, quietly bearing everything, waiting to be removed by the one person who knew where they were. The first was the name. The firm was called Vale Architects. Vale. My name. And in his hunger for the managing role, Adrian had never examined who actually owned the firm's name and brand, the trademark, the reputation embodied in that single word over the door, and the answer was that I did, personally, held in an entity separate from the operating partnership, the way I held everything that mattered because I had learned young, from watching other men lose everything, to keep the crown separate from the kingdom. Adrian could sit in the managing principal's chair of a firm called Vale Architects. He could not become Vale. And he could not, it would turn out, so easily keep using a name he did not own, once the man who owned it decided to take it back. I want to dwell on the name for a moment, because it is the quietest of the three cards and in some ways the most instructive. When I was young, I watched an older architect I admired lose his entire firm, his name and all, in a partnership dispute because he had been careless about the structure, had let his own name become an asset of a partnership he did not control, and had woken up one day to find that other men owned the right to use his name on buildings he had nothing to do with, that his own name had been taken from him and put to work by strangers. It was one of the formative horrors of my early career, and it taught me a principle I have followed ever since, which I think of as keeping the crown separate from the kingdom. The kingdom is the operating business, the firm, the partnership, the thing with the payroll and the politics and the daily war. The crown is the name, the reputation, the intellectual heart, the things that are truly you and can never be replaced. And the deepest, quietest wisdom I have to offer anyone who builds anything is this: never, ever let the crown become an asset of the kingdom, because kingdoms can be captured in coups and divorces and lawsuits and betrayals, and if the crown is part of the kingdom, it is captured too. Keep it separate. Keep it yours. Hold it in your own two hands, personally, outside the reach of any partnership vote or any hungry heir. I had done that with my name for 40 years, not because I ever imagined Adrian, but because a frightened young man had once watched an older man lose his own name and had sworn never to be that man, and that fear, that ancient unglamorous caution, was worth more in the end than all my talent, because talent built the kingdom and caution kept the crown, and when the kingdom was captured, the crown simply walked out the door on the head that had always worn it. Adrian captured a kingdom called Vale and never understood that Vale was not the kingdom's to give him. Vale was always going to leave with me because Vale was never a firm. Vale was a man. The second was the truth about the lantern, and about a dozen other landmark works, the truth about who had actually designed the buildings on which the firm's whole reputation, and increasingly Adrian's personal reputation, rested. Because Adrian had begun, in the press, in lectures, in the careful way he let interviewers assume things, to take a share of credit for work that was mine, and most dangerously, he had begun to let the world believe he had been a central creative force on the lantern itself, the building that had made the firm, a building he had not even been alive to see designed, having been a small child when it opened. It was a small dishonesty at first, a matter of not correcting a flattering assumption. But it was about to matter enormously because a reputation built on stolen credit is a building with a hidden structural flaw, and I had the original drawings, dated, signed, witnessed, and I had 40 years of colleagues who knew exactly whose hand had drawn every line of the lantern, and I held, in short, the power to collapse Adrian's stolen reputation the way you collapse any structure built on a lie, by simply revealing the truth of what actually held it up. And the third thing, the third foundation, was the one that would end it, and it was a woman named Margaret Hollis. Margaret Hollis was, at the time of the gala, 81 years old, and she was the most important client Vale Architects had ever had, and she was, though the word feels too small, my friend. Margaret was the last of a family that had made an enormous fortune generations back, and she had spent her long life giving it away with more taste and more purpose than almost anyone alive, funding museums and concert halls and libraries, and she had a conviction, unfashionable and absolute, that the buildings a society leaves behind are its truest autobiography, that we are remembered by what we build. Margaret and I had met 30 years earlier, when she commissioned a small library from an unknown young architect because something about my drawings moved her, and over the 3 decades since, the Hollis Foundation had been the patron behind many of my finest works, and Margaret and I had become, across all those years and all those buildings, something rarer than client and architect. We had become two people who understood each other. She had held my hand at Helen's funeral. I had sat with her through the loss of her own husband. Ours was a friendship measured in decades and in buildings, and it was not, whatever Adrian believed, a relationship with a firm. It was a relationship with me. Let me tell you about the afternoon in Margaret's garden, a few months before the gala, because it is the fulcrum on which this entire story turned, and neither Adrian nor I fully knew it at the time. Margaret had asked me to tea, which was not unusual. We took tea together several times a year, in her garden when the weather allowed, and we would talk about buildings and books and the people we'd lost, two old friends in the late afternoon of their lives. But this particular afternoon she was different, quieter, and after a while she set down her cup and she said, "Julian, I'm going to build one last thing, and then I'm done. The foundation has the money for something significant, something that will outlast both of us. A great center for the arts, the kind of building a city remembers itself by. And I want it to be ours. Yours and mine. The last one. I've been thinking about it as the bookend to that little library you built me 30 years ago, when nobody knew your name and I took a chance on a young man's drawings. I want to close the circle with the two of us, the way we started." And I was so moved I could barely speak, because I understood what she was giving me. Not just the commission of a lifetime, but a kind of love, the recognition of a friendship that had shaped both our lives. And I took her hand across the tea table, two old people, and I told her it would be the honor of my life. And then Margaret said the thing that would matter more than she could have known. She said, "Now, I know your firm is full of talented young people, and I'm sure that Frost boy you're so proud of is very gifted. But Julian, I want to be clear. This commission is not for Vale Architects. It's for you. If you were to leave that firm tomorrow and set up in a garden shed, the commission would follow you to the garden shed. Do you understand me? I am not hiring a letterhead. I am building a last building with my friend. Where you go, it goes." I laughed at the time and told her I had no intention of decamping to a garden shed, and we moved on to other things. I did not know, could not have known, that within months I would be pushed out of that very firm, and that Margaret Hollis, in a garden on an ordinary afternoon, had already unknowingly sealed Adrian's fate with a single loving sentence. "Where you go, it goes." Adrian was about to seize a firm believing he was seizing that commission, and an 81-year-old woman had already quietly decreed, over tea, that the commission was not the firm's to lose or his to win, because it had never belonged to anything but a friendship he could not see and could not touch and did not even know existed. And here is why that mattered more than anything else in the world at that particular moment. Because the Hollis Foundation was, that very year, preparing to commission the largest and most significant project of Margaret's entire life, the capstone she intended to leave as her final gift to the world, a great new center for the arts, a building of a scale and ambition and public importance that comes along perhaps once in a generation. It was the commission every firm in the country was desperate for, the kind of project that defines a career, cements a reputation, and, not incidentally, is worth a fortune and would anchor the prestige and the finances of whatever firm won it for a decade. And Adrian, in his hunger for the chair, had made a single catastrophic assumption. He had assumed that the Hollis Center Commission belonged to Vale Architects, the firm, and that by capturing the firm, he had captured the commission. He was already, in the weeks after the gala, positioning himself as the visionary who would design it, planning the pitch, imagining the ribbon cutting where the brilliant young managing principal would unveil his masterpiece. He had built his entire new reign on the assumption that the Hollis Commission would be its crown. He had never understood that Margaret Hollis was not commissioning a firm. She was commissioning me. She had told me so privately months before the gala, over tea in her garden, that this last great building was to be ours, hers and mine, the capstone of a 30-year friendship, and that there was no one else on earth she would trust with it. Adrian did not know that. Adrian had made his move against me before that commission was formalized, in the confidence that capturing the chair meant capturing everything the chair touched, and he had no idea that the single most valuable thing in the entire firm, the commission that would define the decade, was not attached to the chair at all. It was attached to a 30-year friendship that his coup had just detonated. The moment Adrian pushed me out, he did not inherit the Hollis Center. He lost it. He simply did not know it yet, and I, in my quiet emeritus corner, watching him plan his pitch for a project that would never be his, understood that the young man had captured the throne room and never noticed that the treasury had walked out the door with the old king. If you have made it this far into an old architect's story, let me ask you the question I turned over in those quiet weeks, because it is not as obvious as it sounds, and I want to know what you would have chosen. I could have simply left, quietly, taken the Hollis Commission and Margaret's friendship and the name that was legally mine, started fresh, and let Adrian discover his loss slowly, privately, as the firm hollowed out around him over months. A quiet exit, clean rebuild, no confrontation, no public reckoning, no exposure. Or I could do the other thing, let him commit fully to his stolen reign, let him stake everything publicly on the Hollis Commission and the legacy he was claiming, and then let the truth arrive all at once, in the open, so that he would understand exactly what he had done and exactly what it had cost him. Mercy and silence, or truth and consequence. And this time the traitor was, God help me, the closest thing I had ever had to a son, and the question of how much truth to let fall on him was the hardest moral question of my life. Tell me in the comments what you would have done to the child you raised who betrayed you, because the answer I chose surprised me, and I am still not certain it was right. I chose to let the truth arrive, but I chose to let it arrive by its own weight rather than by my hand. And there is a difference, and the difference is everything. I did not call the press. I did not denounce Adrian. I did not send out the lantern drawings with a triumphant note. What I did was far quieter and far more devastating. I simply stopped holding up the things that only I held up, and I let the structure Adrian had stolen discover on its own that its foundations were gone. First, I resigned the emeritus title entirely and formally separated myself from the firm, cleanly, completely, a full departure rather than a gracious lingering, and in doing so I put the firm on notice through my attorney Aaron Feld that my continued license of the Vale name to the operating partnership was under review, which is a polite way of saying that the firm called Vale Architects was going to have to reckon with the fact that it no longer contained, and might not be permitted to, keep using the name of anyone named Vale. Then I did the thing that mattered most, and I did it not as a maneuver but as the natural act of a man going where he was wanted. I told Margaret Hollis that I had left the firm and was opening a new studio, a small one, at the end of my career, to do only work I loved. And Margaret Hollis, without a moment's hesitation, said what I already knew she would say, which was that wherever I went, the Hollis Center went with me, because she had never for one instant been commissioning a firm, she had been commissioning her friend, and that the idea of that building being designed by anyone but me was, in her words, absurd. The commission of the decade, the crown of Adrian's stolen reign, the project he was at that very moment preparing to pitch as his masterpiece, followed me out the door to a studio that as yet had barely any furniture, and Adrian did not know for weeks, because Margaret, at my quiet request, let him find out the way he had let me find out about my own removal in his own time to his own devastation. And a number of others followed me too, which taught me something about what I had actually built over 40 years that I had never let myself know. Dorothy Chun, who had run my studio for 30 years, who knew where every drawing and every truth was kept, walked out of Vale Architects the day after I did and appeared at my new studio without my even asking, and said only, "You didn't think I was staying, did you?" And Sophia Marin, the most gifted of the younger architects I had mentored in recent years, a woman I had poured myself into much as I once poured myself into Adrian, but who had turned out to be made of entirely different material, came to me privately and told me that she had refused to be part of the coup, had argued against it, had been outvoted, and that she would not spend her career in a firm run by a man who would do to his mentor what Adrian had done to me, and she left a secure and prestigious position at the firm that bore my name to join a studio that had nothing yet but me and Dorothy and a commission, and I understood, watching Sophia make that choice, that I had, without knowing it, been running a second experiment alongside the one with Adrian, and that the second experiment had produced a person of real character, and that the difference between Adrian and Sophia was not talent. They were both enormously gifted. The difference was something deeper that no mentor can teach and can only hope to find, and that in Sophia I had, at the very end and entirely by accident, found the true heir I had once believed Adrian to be. Let me tell you what Sophia said to me the day she left the firm to join my empty studio, because it is the sentence that healed something in me that Adrian had broken. I had warned her, honestly, that it was a foolish career move, that I was an old man at the end, that the new studio might not last 5 years, that she was leaving certainty for a gamble on a man everyone had just declared finished. And Sophia looked at me and said, "Julian, you taught me that you take the impossible commission, not the safe one, because the safe one makes you competent and the impossible one makes you yourself. You told me that story about the lantern 100 times. Did you mean it? Or was it just a story?" And I had no answer because she had caught me trying to talk her out of applying the exact lesson I had spent years teaching her. And I started to laugh and she started to laugh, and that was the moment I knew that Sophia had understood the real inheritance all along, which was never the firm or the chair or the name. It was the way of seeing, the courage, the standard, the thing I actually had to give, and she had taken it fully, and it had made her not my imitator but herself, which is the only thing a real mentor ever actually wants. Adrian took everything I had and became a thief. Sophia took only what I taught and became an architect. The difference between those two outcomes is the whole of what I have learned about raising the young, and it comes down to this: what a person does with what you give them tells you everything about who they are, and nothing you can do can change which kind of person they turn out to be. You can only, if you're lucky and watchful, notice in time. Now let me tell you what happened to Adrian and the firm, because the collapse, when it came, was as complete as these collapses always are when they are built on a stolen foundation, and it came fast. Adrian learned about the Hollis Center the hard way, in a meeting with the foundation's representatives that he had walked into expecting to discuss his pitch, and in which he was informed, politely, that the foundation would be proceeding with Mr. Vale's new studio, and that the firm's services would not be required. I am told he did not understand it at first, could not process it, kept explaining that he was Vale Architects now, that the relationship was with the firm, and had to be told gently and more than once that no, the relationship had never been with the firm. It had been with the man. And I am told that was the moment the ground truly opened under Adrian Frost, because in that instant he understood that the single most valuable thing he thought he had captured had never been his to capture, and that he had blown up the one relationship in the world that could have delivered it, in the very act of seizing the empty chair. The crown of his reign was gone before his reign had properly begun. Margaret told me about that meeting afterward, and there was no triumph in her telling, only a kind of weary sadness, because Margaret had seen a great many ambitious young people across her long life, and she recognized in Adrian a particular and common tragedy. She said he had actually tried, in that meeting, to charm the foundation's representatives, to turn it around with the same skills that had won him everything else, and that watching him deploy the charm was like watching a man try to talk his way out of gravity, because the foundation was not a room to be worked, it was a decision that had been made 30 years ago in a friendship he had no part in and could not touch. And she said, at the end, that Adrian had asked, with something like desperation, whether there was truly nothing he could do, whether the foundation might reconsider once the transition settled, and that she had told him, kindly, the truest thing anyone could have told him, which was, "Young man, you don't seem to understand. You didn't lose this commission when you took the firm. You lost it years ago. Every time Julian introduced you to someone important with his hand on your shoulder, and you filed it away as a rung instead of a gift. People like me, we watch how the young treat the old who lifted them. We were always watching. You just never knew the watching was the whole test." And Margaret said Adrian had no answer for that, because there was no answer, because she had named the exact thing, that he had been auditioning his whole career for people whose regard he assumed he already had, and had failed the audition years before he knew it was happening, in 100 small moments when he mistook generosity for weakness and mentorship for his due. And then the rest came down the way it does. When word spread through the profession that Julian Vale had left his own firm and taken both the Hollis Center commission and his name with him, the other clients, the ones who had also always been loyal to me and not to a letterhead, began to follow quietly, one after another, the way clients do when they realize the substance has left the building and only the sign remains. The firm that had captured a legend found itself, within months, a firm without the legend, without his name, without his commission, without his clients, and without, increasingly, his reputation, because the final foundation gave way too. As Adrian, desperate to hold together his crumbling prestige, leaned harder than ever on the myth of his own genius, on his implied authorship of the great works. The truth of the lantern became impossible to keep buried, and it did not even require me to reveal it, because a reputation built on a stolen foundation does not need to be pushed, it only needs to be leaned on, and Adrian leaned on it until it broke. When a journalist, researching a profile of the firm's new leader, began asking careful questions about the actual authorship of the lantern and the other landmark works, the answer was in the drawings, dated and signed in my hand, and in the memories of 40 years of colleagues. And the story that emerged was not the story of a young genius, but the story of a man who had taken credit for his mentor's masterpieces and then betrayed that mentor to seize a chair. And there is no reputation in any profession that survives that story, because every client and every peer looks at such a man and thinks, correctly, that he will do it again to them. The specific moment it broke is almost too fitting, and I did not engineer it, which is the part one want you to believe because it matters. A prominent design magazine was preparing a major profile of Adrian, the brilliant young leader of the newly reborn firm. The piece meant to cement his reputation as the heir to a legend, and in the course of it Adrian gave a long interview in which, drunk on the narrative of his own genius and desperate to justify the chair he'd seized, he overreached, as men like Adrian always eventually overreach, and he spoke about the lantern in a way that let the reader believe he had been a formative, creative presence in the firm's defining work, its philosophy, its very lineage. The journalist was good at her job, and she did the thing good journalists do, which is check, and she came eventually to Dorothy because everyone in the profession knew that if you wanted the truth about the history of Vale Architects, you asked Dorothy Chun, who had been there for all of it and forgotten nothing. And Dorothy did not editorialize, did not attack, did not need to. She simply laid out the dated, signed original drawings of the lantern in my hand from years before Adrian was old enough to hold a pencil, along with the records of who had done what across 3 decades. And she let the paper speak, and the paper said, in a language no charm can argue with, that the young genius had been claiming a lineage that was not his, and that the man he had pushed out as obsolete was the actual author of the very legacy he was trying to inherit. The profile that was meant to crown Adrian became, instead, the piece that exposed him, and once that story was in the world, every flattering assumption Adrian had ever allowed about himself curdled into a question. And the questions did what questions do to a reputation built on a stolen foundation, which is bring it down floor by floor until nothing is left standing but the truth. Adrian Frost was left, in the end, sitting in a chair with his name on the door of a firm that still bore my name but had lost the right to keep it, with no crown commission, a fleeing client base, a reputation revealed as partly stolen, and the partners who had backed his coup now scrambling to distance themselves from the disaster they had enabled. Because the people who join a coup are never loyal, they are only opportunistic, and opportunism flees a sinking thing faster than anything else on earth. He had captured everything and inherited nothing, because he had never understood, in his hunger for the visible power, that the visible power was the one thing in the firm that had no value on its own. The chair was just a chair. Everything that made it a throne had been loyal to me, and had left with me, and Adrian was left sitting in the most expensive empty chair in the profession. And then Adrian came to see me, as they always do at the end, and I have to tell you about that conversation because it is the true heart of this story, and it is the part that is not about buildings or commissions or names at all. He came to my new studio on a winter evening, after the collapse was well underway, and the young man who walked in was not the radiant, confident heir who had taken the microphone at the gala. He was diminished, gray, a man watching everything he had seized turn to ash in his hands. And I braced myself because I expected the things I had come to expect from these confrontations, the false apology, the negotiation, the threat, the offer. And Adrian did try some of those. He started with justifications, the firm needed new leadership, the profession was changing, he'd only done what the partners wanted. And when that didn't move me, he tried, and this is the one that nearly broke me, he tried to reach back to what we had been. He called me by the name he used to use, the affectionate one, and he said, "Julian, please, after everything, you were like a father to me." And there it was, the deepest cut of the whole affair, delivered by the one person who could deliver it, because he was right. I had been like a father to him, and he was using that, the most sacred thing between us, as one more tool, one more angle, the way he used everything. And I understood in that moment that Adrian was, at his core, a person for whom even love was an instrument, and that this incapacity to hold anything sacred was the flaw that no amount of talent could outrun, and that had been going to destroy him eventually no matter what, because a man who will use his own father's love as leverage will eventually run out of people who have not learned what he is. And yet, I have to be honest with you because honesty is the whole point of telling you any of this. When Adrian said those words, you were like a father to me, some part of me, the part that had held him at his worst moments and taught him and believed in him and grieved him. Some old helpless part of me wanted them to be true, wanted to believe that under all the calculation there was still the boy who threw down his pencil at 2 a.m, and for one terrible second I felt the pull of it, the pull to forgive, to reach across, to be his father one more time even now. That is the thing no one tells you about being betrayed by someone you love. The love does not obediently die when the betrayal is proven. It lingers stupidly, loyally, reaching for the person who is gone, and it can be used against you, and Adrian was using it against me in that very moment. And the hardest thing was not resisting my anger. I had no trouble with my anger. The hardest thing was resisting my love, the old true love for the boy which wanted to make me a fool one last time. I want anyone who has been betrayed by someone they love to hear this, because you will feel it too, that treacherous pull of the love that won't die, and you will mistake it for weakness or for a sign that you should forgive. And it is neither. It is just the long echo of something real that the other person has already destroyed, and you can honor the love that was real without surrendering to the person who killed it. That is the needle you have to thread. I threaded it. Barely. But I threaded it, and I did not rage at him. I want you to understand that because it is the thing I am most at peace with in this whole story. I looked at the young man I had raised, the son of my spirit, the great gift and the great wound of my later life, and what I felt was not hatred. It was grief, an ocean of it, and underneath the grief, a terrible clarity. And I said to him quietly, Adrian, sit down. I'm going to tell you the truth one time, because I think you've earned the truth even if you've earned nothing else. And because someone should say it to you once before you spend the rest of your life not understanding what happened to you. And he sat, because there was nothing else left for him to do. And I said, you didn't need to take any of it. That's the thing I need you to understand. The thing that I think will haunt you more than losing it all once you're old enough to feel it. It was all going to be yours. All of it. The firm, the chair, the name, everything. I was building toward the day I would hand it to you, freely, with my whole heart, because you were the son I never had and I wanted nothing in this world more than to give you my life's work. You didn't have to steal a single thing. You could have simply waited and been decent, and it would have been a gift, the greatest gift I had to give. But you couldn't bear for it to be a gift. You needed it to be a conquest. You needed to take it rather than receive it, because somewhere in you there's a wound that can only feel worthy of a thing it seized, never a thing it was given. And so you took what I would have handed you, and in the taking you destroyed the one thing that could never be seized and could only ever be given, which was what we were to each other. You didn't steal my chair, Adrian. The chair was always going to be yours. You stole your own inheritance, and you murdered your own father to do it, and the cruelest part, the part I'm genuinely sorry for, is that you're not going to understand what you actually lost until it's far too late to get it back. And Adrian looked at me, and for just a moment, one moment, the instrument maker in him went still, and I saw something real in his face, something that might have been the beginning of understanding, the dawning horror of a man realizing he had burned down a house he could have simply been given the keys to. And then he did the thing that told me he was not ready, might never be ready, because he asked, in a small voice, whether there was any way back, any deal, any arrangement, whether I might bring him into the new studio. Even then, even in the ruins, still looking for the angle, still trying to seize a place rather than earn one. And I stood up, and I said gently, because gentleness was the last gift I had left to give him, no, Adrian. There's no way back to what we were, because you didn't lose it, you chose to destroy it, and some things, once chosen, can't be unchosen. But I'll tell you what I hope. I hope you're young enough to learn the thing you should have learned from me and didn't, which is that the only things worth having are the things you earn and the things you're given, and that the things you take always turn to ash, because taking is the one way of getting a thing that also destroys it. Go build something honest, Adrian. Small, if it has to be. Yours, actually yours, earned. It's the only road back to being someone you could respect, and it doesn't run through me, it runs through you. Now go home, and don't come back looking for a chair. Go make one. And he left, and I have not spoken to him since, and I grieve him still, the boy I raised, the way you grieve a death, because in every way that mattered, the Adrian I loved did die, and the man who took my chair was the stranger who wore his face, and I will mourn the difference for the rest of my life. Let me tell you where it all landed, because you deserve the whole ending, and because the ending is, against all odds, a happy one, or as close to happy as a story with this much grief in it can come. I built the Hollis Center. It is the finest thing I have ever made, and I made it at the end of my career in a small studio with Dorothy running the office and Sophia beside me at the drawing table, and it opened last year to the kind of acclaim that the lantern got 40 years ago, and I stood at its opening, an old man who had been declared past his prime and pushed out of his own firm, and I watched people walk into a building I had made and feel something, which is the only thing I ever wanted to do, and Margaret Hollis, 83 now and frail but fierce, held my arm and she said, "They said you were finished, Julian. Look what finished looks like." And I understood that the whole scheme against me, the whole story that I was past my prime, an obsolete old man, had been a lie all along, and that the proof of the lie was standing all around us, glowing, full of people, real. The obsolete old man had just made the building of his life. Being underestimated, it turns out, is not the same as being finished. It is very often the exact condition under which a person does their finest work, because they have nothing left to protect and no one left to impress and only the work itself to answer to. There is a small, sharp irony I have to share, because it closes a circle that opened on the night this whole story began. About a year after the Hollis Center opened, my profession gave me a Lifetime Achievement Award. A real one, this time, from the most respected body in the field, given not as a velvet coffin but as what such a thing is supposed to be, a genuine recognition of a life's work. And I stood on a stage again, an old man again, in front of many of the same people who had been in the room the night Adrian took my firm. And I thought about the first award, the poisoned one, the one handed to me as an instrument of my removal, and I understood the difference between the two with perfect clarity. The first award was given to end me. The second was given to honor me. And the difference between them was not the award. It was what I had done in the year between, which was to walk out of the coffin they'd built me and construct the finest building of my life. They had tried to use an honor to bury me, and I had made the honor true by refusing to be buried. When I stood to accept that second award, I did not mention Adrian, did not mention the coup, did not settle any scores because the building had settled them for me, and a man whose work has spoken does not need to. I simply thanked the people who had actually stood by me, Dorothy and Sophia and Margaret, and I said one thing that I meant for exactly one person who was not in the room. I said that I had learned, late in life, that you cannot be finished by anyone but yourself, and that being counted out is not the same as being out, and I let it land wherever it landed, and I sat down, and that, more than any collapse of Adrian's, was my true reply to the night he took my chair. Let me go back, though, to the night the Hollis Center itself opened, a year before that award, because I went to Helen that night. I went to where she's buried, on a hill outside the city, which I do when things are large, because 30 years of marriage does not end at a graveside. It just changes into a quieter kind of conversation, and I had a great deal to tell her. I stood there in the dark in my good coat, an old man who had just opened the finest building of his life, and I told Helen everything about Adrian, about the gala, about the coup and the quiet weeks and the reversal, about Margaret in the garden and Dorothy with her files and Sophia walking out of a good job for the right reason. And I told her the thing I'd come to say, which was that she'd been right in one dinner 12 years and a lifetime ago. Watch that it stays a good hunger, and that I hadn't listened, and that it had cost me, and that I was sorry I hadn't had her eyes to borrow when it mattered. And then, standing there, I understood something that I think Helen would have wanted me to understand, which was that the reason I hadn't listened wasn't stupidity, it was love, it was a grieving man's need for a son, and that love is not a thing to apologize for even when it blinds you, because a life spent so guarded that no one can ever betray you is not a life Helen would have wanted me to live, and is not, in fact, a life at all. I had loved Adrian with my whole heart and been betrayed, and I would rather be the man who loved and was betrayed than the man who trusted no one and so lost nothing, because the first man is alive and the second is just a wall standing where a person used to be. Helen taught me that, mostly by being the least guarded person I ever knew, and standing at her grave the night I opened the Hollis Center, I forgave myself, finally, for having loved my betrayer, because loving is not the mistake, it is the whole point, and the ones who make you regret it are revealing their poverty, not yours. I told Helen I loved her, and that the building glowed, that it caught the light coming off the water just the way she taught me, and I drove home an old man who had lost a great deal and kept the only things that mattered, and I slept, that night, better than I had in years. Vale Architects, the firm Adrian stole, no longer exists under that name. It lost the right to it, and what remained of it was absorbed, diminished into a larger firm, its identity erased, which is a strange kind of justice, that the man who seized my name to inherit my legacy ended by extinguishing the name entirely. My legacy lives now not in that dead firm but in the lantern, still glowing on its riverbank, and in the Hala Center, and in the chapel, and in the buildings, which is where a legacy should live, in the work and not in the letterhead. And it lives in Sophia, who is the real thing, and to whom I am doing now, carefully, the thing I once tried to do with Adrian, pouring myself into her, teaching her everything, building toward the day I hand her the studio, freely, with my whole heart. Except this time I am not afraid, because Sophia has already shown me who she is. She showed me the day she walked out of a prestigious job rather than participate in a betrayal, and a person's character is revealed not by what they take when they're hungry but by what they refuse to take when it's offered, and Sophia refused the easy road when it was right in front of her, which is the truest signature of character there is. She will not steal my chair. She doesn't need to. It's already hers the moment I'm ready to give it, and she knows how to wait for a gift, which is the one thing Adrian never learned, and the difference between them is the difference between an heir and a thief. And it turns out to have nothing to do with talent at all. We are designing a building together now, Sophia and I, a small library, and I chose a library on purpose because a library was my first real commission, the one Margaret took a chance on 30 years ago, and I wanted Sophia's first project as my true partner to close the same circle mine had opened. And I do it differently now than I did with Adrian, not because I love Sophia more, but because I finally understand what I got wrong, which was that with Adrian I mentored the talent and assumed the character, and with Sophia I watch the character and let the talent take care of itself. I watch how she treats the young interns who can do nothing for her. I watch how she handles being told no, being told a design isn't working, being told to start over, and she takes it the way the real ones take it, as information rather than insult. I watch whether she reaches for credit or hands it away, and she hands it away reflexively the way only the secure do. These are the things I never watched in Adrian because I was too busy being dazzled, and they are the only things that actually matter, and I am teaching Sophia everything I know while watching, always watching the small true signs, and every one of them is good, and I am not afraid anymore. It is a strange gift to have been betrayed so completely that you finally learn to see clearly, and to get, at the very end of your life, a second chance to do the most important thing you do, the passing on, and to do it right this time. Adrian took that from me and, without meaning to, gave it back because the wound he left is the exact reason I now see Sophia clearly. And there is a kind of justice in that too, that the betrayer's final unwilling gift is to make his victim wiser than the betrayal. My name is Julian Vale. I want to tell you what I learned, and it is the only thing I have to give you at the end of all this. If you are a mentor, if you have ever poured yourself into a younger person, a protégé, an heir, a student, a child of your spirit, then you know the particular joy of it, the way it is the closest thing there is to defeating death, to sending something of yourself forward into a world you won't live to see. And I want you to keep doing it. Keep pouring yourself into the young, because it is one of the most beautiful things a human being can do and the world runs on it. But I want to tell you the hard thing I learned, which is that you cannot give a person character, you can only give them capability, and if you pour capability into a person who lacks character, you have not created an heir, you have armed a rival, and you will not know which one you made until the day the stakes are real. I gave Adrian everything I knew, and everything I knew made him more dangerous, not more trustworthy, because the missing thing was not in my power to give. So mentor with your whole heart, but keep your eyes open and watch not for how talented they are but for how they treat people who can do nothing for them, and how they handle the word no, and whether they can receive a gift or only seize a prize, because those small things, not the talent, are the whole of the matter, and I missed them in Adrian because I was so dazzled by the gift that I forgot to check the foundation, and you must never, ever forget to check the foundation, not in a building and not in a person. And here is the last thing, the thing I most want you to carry, whoever you are. They will tell you when you get older that you are past your prime, that your era is over, that it is time to step aside and let the young and the hungry take what you built. And some of the people who tell you this will mean it kindly, and some will mean it as a knife, and it will be very hard sometimes to tell the difference. But I want you to know, from an old man who was pushed out of his own firm with a Lifetime Achievement Award and who then went and built the finest work of his life, that being underestimated is not the same as being finished, that the chair is never the thing, that the substance of what you've built lives in you and not in any title they can take away, and that the people who truly love you and truly value your work will follow you out the door when you leave, and the ones who don't were never yours to begin with. They can take your chair. Let them have it. Walk out the door and take the treasury with you, which is your name, your relationships, your knowledge, your character, the actual substance. All the things they never understood were the real prize because they were so fixated on the visible one. And then go build the finest thing you've ever built, out of spite if you have to, out of joy if you can manage it, and let the empty chair they fought so hard to steal stand as a monument to how little they understood about what actually holds a life up. So let me leave you with the question I have carried since that gala, and let me ask it plainly. If the person you raised, mentored, loved like your own child, betrayed you with the very gifts you gave them, and stole the chair you were going to hand them anyway, what would you do? Would you destroy them completely? Or would you let the truth fall on them by its own weight and grieve the child you lost? And could you resist becoming bitter, becoming the very obsolete, defeated old man they said you were? Or would you go and prove them wrong with the work itself? Tell me in the comments, because I think there are more betrayed mentors listening than anyone knows, people who armed a rival while trying to raise an heir, and they need to hear from each other that it is survivable, and that the chair was never the thing. I raised the knife that cut me, and I grieve him still, and I also built the finest work of my life afterward, and both of those are true, and if you are ever where I was, I hope you'll remember that both can be true for you too. They can take the chair. They can never take the thing that made you worth stealing from. That was always yours. Go build something with it,